A veteran Navy SEAL walks the northern woods, not searching for anything, just trying to stay quiet inside. His dog stops suddenly, nose in the wind, as if the forest itself just spoke. Hidden under rust, mud, and years of silence lies a giant no one was meant to forget. Inside that steel beast, a name, a promise, and a grief still waiting for an answer. What begins as a strange discovery becomes a test of faith, loyalty, and second chances. Because sometimes the miracle isn't what you find, but who refuses to let you walk away. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. Late spring in the far north had a way of pretending winter had never been cruel. The lake lay smooth as polished glass, reflecting a sky so blue it felt newly invented. Pines crowded the shoreline in dark, patient ranks, their needles whispering whenever the wind slid through them. Somewhere deeper in the woods, meltwater sang under old snowbanks, and the air smelled clean, like stone, sap, and the promise of another day that might behave. Gideon "Gid" Rourke moved along the trail as if he'd been built for it. He was 43 and stood about 6'1", broad through the shoulders, solid in the way that didn't come from vanity but from years of being trained to endure. His face was angular, jaw sharp enough to look like it had been carved rather than grown. A dusting of beard, more shadow than style, clung along his cheeks and chin. His eyes were a quiet blue-gray, the color of steel left out in rain, and they watched the world with a depth that made most people talk a little faster and laugh a little louder around him, as if trying to fill the silence he carried. His hair was clipped short in a practical military cut, dark brown with early silver at the temples, like frost refusing to fully leave. His skin was tanned from being outdoors, from wind and sun and long walks he didn't always remember starting. He wore the same outfit the way some men wore a habit. An olive field jacket with pockets that had seen better days. Dark blue cargo pants, scuffed at the knees. Under the jacket, a red and deep green plaid shirt that made him look almost friendly, almost. Brown leather boots, worn and creased, like they'd learned the shape of his steps and decided not to argue with them anymore. A beat-up military watch sat on his wrist, its face scratched but faithful. A folding pocket knife rode in his pocket, not as a threat, just as a tool. Because Gideon believed tools were honest in a way people often weren't. And on his back was an Eberly stock, half-track pack, heavy with the neat, quiet preparedness of a man who didn't trust luck to do its job. Beside him trotted Valko. The German Shepherd was a K9 by training and by temperament, a working dog down to the bones. He wasn't the oversized kind that looked like a wolf auditioning for a movie. Valko was balanced, muscular without being bulky, all clean lines and coiled strength. His coat was short and dense, black and tan, gleaming when the sun hit him, like armor you could pet. His eyes were dark and intelligent, always scanning, always measuring. The dog moved with a steady confidence that said he didn't need to prove anything. A black tactical harness hugged his chest and back, simple and sturdy with a handle on top, because some terrain demanded lifting rather than asking. Valko's ears pivoted constantly, tracking distant bird calls, the sigh of wind through pine needles, the faint crack of a twig somewhere that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. Gideon walked as part of a volunteer search and rescue routine, though he'd never call it that aloud. He told people he was helping out, the way you might describe holding a door open. It was easier than saying the truth, that if he didn't give his mind a job, it would go looking for war where there was none. He and Valko had a quiet rhythm. The leash hung slack most of the time. Valko stayed close without crowding, like a shadow with a heartbeat. Gideon's humor, when it escaped, came out dry and sideways, like a stone skipped across water. "You're gonna find a treasure chest out here one day," he muttered, scanning the trail ahead. "If you do, I get 60%. Valco flicked an ear back as if to say, "Your math is bold for a man who can't remember to buy bread." The trail they followed was familiar, a local loop used by hikers and fishermen, edged with young birch and underbrush that glowed a bright, eager green. Gideon liked familiar trails. Familiar meant fewer surprises. Fewer surprises meant fewer ghosts. But then the wind changed. It happened so subtly that Gideon might not have noticed. Except Valco did. The dog stopped mid-step. Not a hesitant pause, a full stop, like someone had pressed a button. Valco's head lifted. His nostrils flared. His eyes narrowed toward the woods, not with fear, but with focus. His body shifted slightly forward, weight ready. A quiet electricity moved through him. Gideon slowed, watching. "What is it?" he asked, though he knew better than to expect an answer. Valco's gaze held on an invisible point in the trees. The dog's ears angled forward, then slightly out, triangulating. He inhaled again, deeper this time, like he was reading a sentence written in the air. Then he turned, firm and certain, and tugged Gideon off the main trail. Gideon frowned. "Hey, that's not the loop." Valco didn't look back. He just pulled with that calm insistence K9 handlers knew well. This is not a suggestion. Gideon followed, boots crunching through last year's needles. The forest thickened. Sunlight thinned into pale beams. The air turned cooler, damper, carrying the scent of moss and old wood. And something else. Metal. Not the bright bite of a new tool or fresh nail. This was older. Rust, oil. The tired scent of iron that had been wet and forgotten. Gideon felt his shoulders tighten in a way he hadn't invited. "Of course," he murmured. "The dog smells a ghost made of steel." Valco pressed on, weaving between pines, stepping over fallen branches with precise economy. Gideon kept one hand near the strap of his pack, not out of panic, out of habit. His body remembered danger the way the lake remembered ice. They reached a stretch of forest where trees had fallen in tangled heaps, as if a storm had once slammed the place and never apologized. Thick trunks lay crisscrossed, half buried in leaves and new growth. The ground dipped slightly, making the air feel heavier. Valco moved faster now, tail steady, head low, nose working hard. Gideon's eyes caught on something unnatural, an angle that didn't belong among the curves of bark and brush. A dark shape behind the fallen trees. At first it looked like a boulder, then it looked like a shadow wearing the wrong geometry. Then the sun hit it through the branches, and Gideon saw the dull sheen of metal under moss and grime. His breath caught in his throat, shallow and uninvited. There, half swallowed by the forest, lay a massive truck, an old semi-style cab modified into something monstrous. The front was broad and aggressive, its grille like a clenched jaw. The tires were enormous, caked in mud, half sunk into the earth as if the ground had tried to keep it. Vines crawled over the frame. Rust freckled its body like age spots. It lay tilted, not quite toppled, as though it had stumbled and never managed to stand again. A monster truck, Gideon thought with a faint disbelief, sitting in the woods like a myth that forgot it was supposed to be loud and proud. Valco approached it carefully, not spooked, not playful. Reverent wasn't the right word, but it wasn't far off. The dog lowered his head and pressed his nose to the rubber of the nearest tire. He inhaled once, twice. Then he lifted his head and looked at Gideon. The dog's eyes were steady, dark, bright, full of knowing. And Gideon, who had faced men with weapons and oceans with storms, felt something colder than fear brush his spine. Because Valco wasn't just saying, "Look what I found." Valco was saying, "This matters." Valco suddenly backed away from the tire and sat down, straight, deliberate, like he'd been given a command. But Gideon hadn't said a word. The dog's ears were forward, his eyes fixed on a point beneath the truck's cab, not moving, not blinking. His body was tense, but controlled. Not alarmed. Focused. Then Valco made a sound Gideon rarely heard from him. A low, soft whine. Brief, almost swallowed. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Gideon's throat tightened. He crouched, scanning under the cab. The shadows were thick there. The forest felt like it had leaned closer to watch. "Valco," he said quietly. "What do you see?" Valco didn't move. He didn't look at Gideon. He stared beneath the machine like something was written there in a language only he could read. And Gideon, without knowing why, felt the strange certainty that they were not alone in this moment. Not physically. The woods were silent, except for wind and distant birds. But the air had changed. It carried a weight. Like a story had been waiting, holding its breath. And Valco had just spoken the first word aloud. Gideon forced himself to move. He shifted closer, keeping his balance on slick needles and damp leaves. He leaned down, trying to see what Valco saw. Nothing. Just shadow. A tangle of old branches, a glimpse of rusted undercarriage. Yet Valco's entire posture insisted otherwise. It made Gideon uneasy in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with memory. Because Gideon knew that sometimes the first warning didn't come from what you could see. Sometimes it came from the part of you that had survived too much and learned to read the world before it spoke. He exhaled slowly, hands open, calming both himself and the dog. "All right," he whispered, a hint of that dry humor trying to keep the moment from swallowing him. "You found the treasure. It's a several-ton treasure. You're getting your 40%, buddy." Valco finally stood, moving to Gideon's side. But the dog kept glancing under the cab, as if afraid the forest would erase what it had revealed. Gideon rose, circling the truck with careful steps. He studied the way it had been wedged behind fallen timber, the way trees had grown up around it. This wasn't something that had simply wandered off the road last week. It had been here a long time, long enough for the woods to start calling it theirs. Gideon's mind began doing what it always did. Assessing, cataloging, planning. The old habit of missions returning like a tide. But beneath the practical thoughts, something else stirred. Something quieter, more human. A sense of abandonment. He'd seen that before too, not in machines, but in people. In empty houses, in letters never sent. In the way survivors sometimes looked at you when they didn't know what to do with their grief. Valco pressed against Gideon's leg, steadying him without making a fuss. Gideon swallowed, feeling the familiar ache behind his ribs, the one he carried like a second heart. He stepped closer to the cab and reached out. His fingers met cold metal. Damp, rough with rust, slick with moss. The truck's skin felt like a bruise, and in that instant, Gideon heard it. Not an actual sound in the air, nothing the birds reacted to, nothing Valco barked at, but a metallic echo in his mind, like a distant clang of gear on steel. A memory of other metal, other nights, other orders. His jaw tightened. His hand stayed on the truck anyway, because some part of him, some stubborn, battered part, recognized this feeling. The feeling of something left behind. And Gideon Rourke, for all his silence and scars, had never been good at walking away from that. He kept his palm on the truck's cold body, as if making a vow without words. Valco watched him, eyes steady, breathing slow. The lake wind stirred the pines, and somewhere in the trees, a branch creaked like an old door. Gideon didn't pull his hand back. Not yet. Gideon didn't notice he'd been holding his breath until his lungs demanded payment. He let the air out slow, a controlled exhale the way he'd been taught to do when the world narrowed to one dangerous detail. His palm came off the truck's skin, and the cold lingered on his fingers like a warning that refused to leave. The forest was still bright. Sunlight threading through pine boughs, lake wind slipping between trunks. But Gideon's body had shifted into a different season. The kind that lived inside him. The kind that didn't care what month it was. Valco stood close, steady, watching Gideon's face more than the truck. The dog had learned the shape of Gideon's storms, the way his jaw tightened first, the way his shoulders lifted a fraction, the way his eyes went distant as if listening to something no one else could hear. Gideon forced himself back into the present by doing what he always did. He assessed. The truck wasn't just abandoned. It was claimed. By time, by weather, by the woods. Moss had made a soft carpet over parts of the hood. Rust had freckled the frame. Vines had stitched themselves along the metal as if mending something broken. He stepped closer to the cab. The door was half hidden behind a fallen limb, and the handle was crusted with grime. He tested it carefully. It didn't budge. Of course, Gideon muttered, dry as sand. Locked by Mother Nature. He slid his pocket knife open. Not with drama, just with the practical click of a tool being asked to work. He used the blade to pry at a seam where the door had warped. The metal complained, a long, reluctant groan. Valco shifted, ears forward, scanning the trees. The dog wasn't anxious. He was alert in that disciplined way canines carried themselves, an awareness that danger didn't announce itself before it arrived. The door gave an inch. Gideon leaned his shoulder in, and the second time it moved with a sigh. Like something letting go. A stale breath rolled out of the cab, damp upholstery, old oil, and the faint metallic tang of iron that had been wet too many times. Gideon's stomach tightened, not from disgust, from recognition. Inside, the cabin looked like a time capsule that had been dropped and cracked open. The seats were torn, the dashboard was dusted with rot and pine needles. The steering wheel had that grimy shine of something once held often, now left to the mercy of mold. Gideon climbed up, careful where he placed his weight. The floor felt solid enough, but he didn't trust anything that had been alone in the woods for years. His flashlight cut a white beam across the interior. In the corner, a crushed soda can. Under the passenger seat, a tangle of wiring and dead leaves. In the glove compartment, a brittle stack of papers that crumbled when he touched them. Receipts, faded notes, a map with a corner missing. Valco remained on the ground, circling the truck at a measured pace, nose low. The harness on his back caught a stripe of sunlight, making him look like a soldier wearing a black vest. His tail was steady, neither wagging nor tucked. Businesslike. Gideon opened the center console. That's where he found the bag. It was a small, weatherproof pouch, wedged beneath a layer of grime like someone had tucked it away on purpose. Gideon lifted it slowly, as if sudden movement might startle the past. The zipper resisted at first, then gave. Inside was a tight bundle of meaning. A few photographs, their edges curled but their faces still readable. A thin wooden tag engraved with a single name, Hollis. A strip of cloth folded neatly, protected from moisture as if it mattered more than anything else in the cab. And a note, written in blocky handwriting. The ink faded but stubbornly present. If someone finds this, please don't let it die out here. Gideon stared at the note until the words stopped being letters and started being a voice. He'd heard voices like that before. Men who didn't ask for glory, just for something not to be abandoned. He slid the tag into his palm. Hollis. The name settled into him like a stone dropped in water. Quiet, heavy, rippling outward. Valco climbed onto a fallen log to bring his head level with the open door. The dog sniffed the air, then angled his nose toward the pouch. His eyes sharpened, focus narrowing to a point. Gideon held the pouch closer, letting Valco work. The dog sniffed the photographs first, briefly, politely, like flipping through pages. Then Valco reached the cloth. His breathing changed. It wasn't dramatic. Just a subtle deepening, a steadier pull of air through his nose. His ears tipped forward. His body became still in a way that meant locked on. Gideon watched, heart thudding once, harder than it needed to. Valco sniffed the cloth again, and again. Then he pulled his head back slightly, eyes fixed on Gideon, as if asking a question without words. Gideon swallowed. He remembered last week, the small, windowless room at the sheriff's office where Deputy Lila Vance had handed him a sealed evidence envelope. The label had been old, the paper yellowed, the writing careful. A scent article connected to a cold case. Cyrus Hollis, missing, presumed dead, but never fully closed in the minds of the people who still lived near the lake. Lila had been practical about it, but her eyes had carried the quiet gravity of someone who'd seen too many families left in limbo. She'd asked Gideon if Valco could be useful, just to rule out a possibility, just to do due diligence. Gideon had said yes because saying no felt like leaving something undone. Now Valco's reaction to the cloth in Gideon's hand matched the intensity he'd shown in training. Not the same scent. Time changed everything. But close enough for a working dog to recognize the family of it. Close enough to feel like a thread connecting a name on a tag to a story still open somewhere. Gideon's mouth went dry. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than Valco. "Okay." He climbed down from the cab, pouch in hand, and knelt beside Valco. The dog stepped closer, nose hovering over the cloth again, inhaling as if committing it to memory. Gideon rested a hand on Valco's shoulder, a steadying touch, not a command. "You're telling me this isn't just a truck," he murmured. Valco didn't wag, he didn't bark. He simply held Gideon's gaze, eyes dark and unblinking, like a compass refusing to spin. Gideon looked back at the truck, at the way it had been wedged behind storm-felled timber, at the way the forest had tried to swallow its shape, at the way the machine seemed to wait, not for rescue, but for acknowledgement. He took out his phone, thumb stiff in the cold shade, and snapped a few photos. Wide shots of the location, close-ups of the cab, the tires, the VIN plate he could barely see through grime. Evidence. Documentation. The kind of cautious behavior that kept good intentions from becoming bad mistakes. He marked the GPS coordinates. Then he did something he hadn't planned. He spoke out loud, soft, almost like a prayer. "I don't know who you are," he said to the empty woods, the truck, the name on the tag, maybe all three. "But you got my attention." The wind stirred the pines, and Gideon felt foolish for a second. Then Valco's posture shifted. The dog froze, ears sharp, head turning toward the deeper woods. His muscles tensed beneath his coat, ready but controlled. Not fear, alert. Gideon followed Valco's gaze. There was nothing obvious. No movement in the brush, no animal silhouette, just the layered green and brown of the forest, sunlight glinting in patches. Gideon's hand drifted toward his pocket knife by instinct. "What now?" he asked, voice low. Valco didn't move, but his breathing changed. Shorter, more deliberate. He wasn't tracking a deer. This wasn't prey. This was unfamiliar. Gideon listened. At first he heard only wind and distant water. Then faintly, so faint he wondered if his mind invented it, came a metallic clink. Not from the truck, from somewhere deeper. A soft, rhythmic sound like chain against wood. Gideon's skin prickled. Not because he believed in ghosts, exactly, but because he believed in patterns. And because his life had taught him that when a dog said, "Pay attention," you listened. Valko suddenly turned away from the truck and walked, slowly, deliberately, toward a line of trees that looked no different from the rest. Gideon stayed still for a beat, watching the dog's tail, the set of his shoulders. Valko wasn't chasing. He wasn't playing. He was following something with the quiet certainty of a trained mind. "Valko," Gideon called softly. "Heel." The dog paused, looked back once, just once, eyes intense as if to say, "Not yet." Then Valko continued, weaving between trunks like he'd been given a private set of directions. Gideon's pulse thudded. The old soldier part of him hated not knowing. The human part of him hated the way curiosity could feel like hope. He followed. The trees opened into a small clearing, hardly more than a pocket of space where sunlight pooled. Valko stopped at the base of a birch and lowered his nose to the ground. Gideon stepped closer and saw it. A half-buried metal ring, rusted, attached to a length of chain, disappearing into the soil, an old anchor point, maybe from logging days. Beside it, pressed into the dirt and preserved by shade, were faint tire impressions. Wide, deep, unnatural. Not new, but not ancient either. Gideon's breath caught. This wasn't only a story of something forgotten. It was a story of something handled, moved, anchored, hidden with intention. He looked at Valko. The dog lifted his head and stared at Gideon with that same steady intelligence, like he'd just placed a clue on the table and was waiting to see if Gideon would understand the game. Gideon felt a chill despite the spring air, because an abandoned truck was one thing. But signs of deliberate concealment? Of chains? Of someone using this place like a secret? That meant the woods weren't just holding a relic. They were holding a reason. And Gideon, against his better judgment, felt the hook set. Back at the truck, Gideon's mind ran through possibilities, each one heavier than the last. Maybe the truck had been dragged here from a private logging road. Maybe someone tried to recover it and failed. Maybe it had been left as collateral, hidden from eyes that had no business seeing it. Or maybe, most unsettling of all, it had been placed here because someone wanted it found, only by the right kind of seeker. Gideon shook that thought off. He didn't do mysticism. He did facts. But Valko had a way of bending Gideon toward belief without ever asking for it. Gideon returned to the cab, took one more careful sweep with his flashlight, and found a detail that tightened the story. A faded stamp on one of the photograph's backs, half smeared by time. A local print shop name from town. A date. Not recent, years ago, but clear enough to tell Gideon this wasn't a decades-old artifact. This had lived in the orbit of the town, in the orbit of people. He tucked everything back into the pouch and sealed it. Then he held the wooden Hollis tag up again, turning it in his fingers. The letters weren't fancy, just simple carving, the kind done by a steady hand, the kind that marked ownership the way a name on a mailbox marked home. Gideon looked at Valko. "You recognized him," Gideon said quietly. "Or, at least, you recognized something about him." Valko's ears flicked. His gaze stayed fixed. Gideon's humor surfaced, small and dry, like a match in a dark room. "Great," he murmured. "We found a truck, a name, and a mystery. That's exactly what I wanted on my day off." Valko's mouth opened slightly in a dog's version of a grin, brief, subtle, almost smug. Gideon zipped his jacket higher and turned his eyes back to the forest, then the lake beyond. The world was still beautiful. The world always stayed beautiful, even when it was hiding broken things. He tucked the pouch into his pack, close to his spine, as if carrying it like a responsibility rather than an object. Then he looked one last time at the truck. This huge, silent beast, half wedged in the trees, and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't heroism. It was recognition. He'd seen what happened when things got left behind. He knew the cost of it. He took the Hollis tag in his hand and closed his fingers around it. Somewhere in his chest, something old stirred. Not pain exactly, but a sense of being called to stand up and answer. The wind off the lake moved through the pines again, and Gideon understood, with a clarity that made him both tired and awake, that this wasn't just wreckage. This was a legacy waiting to be claimed. By the time Gideon Rourke reached the edge of town, the lake had changed moods. Morning light still skimmed its surface, but clouds were gathering in the west, thin at first, then thicker, like a thought that refused to be ignored. Gideon parked his truck near the sheriff's office, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't rush into buildings anymore. Rushing was how you missed details. Rushing was how you mistook urgency for truth. Valco waited in the passenger seat, posture calm, eyes alert. The dog's head followed a gull drifting past the windshield, then settled back on Gideon, not questioning, just present. Inside, Deputy Lila Vance looked up from her desk as Gideon stepped in. She was in her late 30s, tall and spare, with a straight-backed posture that suggested she'd grown up learning to take responsibility early. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a low bun that meant business, not fashion. Her uniform fit, neatly, unadorned by excess, and her face, freckled lightly across the nose, carried the expression of someone who didn't waste words because she'd learned how easily they could be misunderstood. "Rourke," she said, nodding once. "You look like you found something." Gideon set his pack down and removed the pouch carefully, like it might bruise. "I think I did," he said. Lila listened while he spoke. Really listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't jump to conclusions. When Gideon finished, she leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes thoughtful. "That area," she said finally, "sits right on the boundary. Old Hollis timberland. Private, but neglected. The Forest Service monitors runoff because it feeds into the lake." She stood and reached for a map pinned to the wall. "If you want to move anything that heavy, we'll need permits, environmental review, and before any of that, VIN check." Gideon nodded. He'd expected nothing less. "I don't want this turning into a mess," he said. "For anyone." Lila's gaze softened a fraction. "That's why I'll help," she replied. "But only if we do it right." She slid a card across the desk. "Ranger Owen Calder. He knows that land better than anyone alive." Ranger Owen Calder met them later that afternoon at the edge of the woods. He was built like a man who had never learned to slouch, lean, sun-weathered, with a beard the color of iron filings and eyes pale as winter sky. His uniform was faded from years of use, boots scarred by rocks and roots. When he shook Gideon's hand, his grip was firm but careful, like someone who respected bones. "That truck of yours," Owen said, adjusting his hat against the breeze, "has been sleeping in tricky ground." He led them through a series of old logging paths, pointing with a knotted finger. "See that depression? Looks solid. It's not. Sinkhole waiting for weight. And there, used to be a service road. Now it's mulch and lies." Valco moved ahead, nose low, tail steady. Owen watched the dog with quiet approval. "Good animal," he said. "Pays attention." Gideon smiled faintly. "He taught me." Owen stopped near a cluster of fallen trees, gaze fixed on the hidden truck beyond. "Nature's patient," he said. She'll keep anything you give her. You want that machine back? You don't fight her. You negotiate. Negotiation meant people. The first was Earl Bledsoe. Earl's workshop sat on the edge of town, a low building that smelled of metal, oil, and coffee, burned too many times. Earl himself was in his early 60s, broad as an oak stump, with hands scarred by decades of welding and a laugh that burst out of him like a loose bolt. He wore a stained canvas jacket and jeans that had long ago given up pretending to be clean. His white beard framed a grin that suggested he'd seen most disasters coming and survived them anyway. "You want to pull a monster truck out of the woods?" Earl said, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's not a job. That's a marriage." He listened, then nodded. "I'm in," he said. "But I'm not bringing feelings. I'm bringing steel." Earl made the call to Maya Larkin. Maya arrived an hour later in a battered pickup, stepping out with the calm confidence of someone who trusted numbers more than luck. She was in her early 40s, medium height, dark hair braided down her back, safety glasses perched on her head like a crown she'd earned. Her hands were clean, engineers' hands, not mechanics. But her eyes were sharp and unromantic. She studied the photos, the angles, the terrain. "If you pull from the wrong point," she said, tapping the image, "the center of mass shifts. The truck rolls. Best case, you lose equipment. Worst case, someone gets crushed." She looked at Gideon. "Patience is cheaper than funerals." The last man came quieter. Hank Morrow drove the tow rig. He was tall, thin, with a face carved deep by time and regret. His hair had gone gray early, and his eyes carried the guarded distance of someone who measured joy carefully. He wore a brown canvas jacket and gloves that had been mended more than replaced. When Gideon explained the job, Hank didn't smile. "Monster trucks," he said flatly. "Hate them." Gideon waited. "My boy loved them," Hank continued. "Sounded like thunder, until thunder took him." Silence settled. "But," Hank said after a beat, "machines don't get to decide who they hurt. People do. I'll help." They assembled at the site 2 days later. Winches, cables, pulleys, laid out with the reverence of tools that demanded respect. Maya calculated angles. Owen marked safe ground. Earl reinforced anchor points. Hank checked tension like a man listening for lies. Valco moved through it all like he belonged. Alert, controlled, avoiding cables without being told. The first pull was cautious. The cable tightened. The winch groaned. The truck shuddered. Then the line slipped. The truck moved an inch and stopped. No one cursed. No one rushed. Maya exhaled. "Bad angle," she said. "Again would be worse." Gideon felt the familiar tug inside him, the urge to push harder, faster. But Valco stepped into his peripheral vision and stopped. Body squared, gaze steady. Gideon recognized the moment for what it was. Slow down. As the team reset, Valco suddenly lowered his head and sat, again deliberate, composed. But this time, his attention wasn't on the truck. It was on Gideon. The dog's eyes held his, unblinking, as if measuring something unseen. Not warning, not fear. Trust. Gideon's breath hitched. For a fleeting second, he felt the weight of every choice pressing down, not just about steel and cables, but about whether he could do this without becoming the man who broke things by forcing them. Valco leaned forward and pressed his forehead lightly against Gideon's knee, grounding him, reminding him where he stood. Gideon placed a hand on the dog's neck and nodded once. "All right," he murmured. "Your pace." They adjusted the plan. New anchor points, changed vectors, patience instead of power. The truck didn't come free that day, but it shifted, cleanly, safely, just enough to promise that it could. As the sun dipped low, painting the lake in copper and gold, The team stood back, tired but intact. Owen surveyed the ground. "She'll move," he said. "Just not on your schedule." Gideon looked at the truck, silent, massive, waiting. For the first time, he didn't feel frustrated. He felt committed. Because some things, he knew, didn't need to be conquered. They needed to be earned. The second day at the logging site arrived with a softer sky. Clouds drifted like thin wool over the lake, muting the light but not the color. The pines still stood tall and watchful, their trunks dark against the pale day. The air smelled of damp earth and old sap, the kind of scent that made Gideon think of clean beginnings, until he remembered how easily beginnings could become endings. They'd come back prepared. Hank's tow rig sat on the old service path like a patient animal, cables neatly coiled, pulleys sorted by size. Maya had a clipboard and a pencil tucked behind her ear, already calculating loads as if numbers might keep grief from happening. Earl carried a thermos the size of a small cannon and a grin that suggested he'd decided this whole thing was either going to be a miracle or a comedy. And either way, he planned to enjoy the show. Gideon moved quieter than the others, his steps measured, his olive field jacket blending into the woods like camouflage that had forgotten war and learned weather. The Eberly stock pack sat high and tight on his shoulders. The wooden Hollis tag and the sealed pouch rode inside it, close to his spine, where responsibility lived. Valco trotted ahead, black and tan coat sleek despite the damp. His harness was snug, the handle on his back catching flashes of gray light. He moved with that disciplined K9 economy. No wasted energy, no wasted attention. When he stopped, it meant something. Owen Calder, the ranger, met them near a stand of birches. He wore the same faded green uniform and the same expression that said the forest had taught him patience the hard way. He pointed out a section of ground where the soil looked firm, but wasn't. "Stay off that," he warned. "Looks like earth. It's a sponge." Maya marked it on her sheet. Hank nodded once. Earl muttered, "Sponge earth. Great. My favorite." They reset anchor points. Hank rigged the snatch block. Maya adjusted the angle. Earl hammered a steel stake with the tenderness of a man who loved loud noises but hated ambulances. The truck in the trees looked unchanged. Still massive, still quiet, still wedged in storm-fallen timber like the forest had folded it into a secret. But Gideon had learned in other places that what looked unchanged could be shifting under the surface. They were about to make the first pull when Valco stopped. Not the kind of stop from the day before. This wasn't about the truck or the cables or the ground. Valco's head lifted, ears forward, body turning toward the far edge of the clearing where the logging land sloped gently into a sparse line of trees. His mouth opened once, a single bark, sharp, clear, not aggressive. Then another. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't the intruder bark. It sounded like a call. Gideon's eyes narrowed. Hank paused with a gloved hand on the cable. Maya looked up from her clipboard. Earl's grin faded to curiosity. Owen followed Valco's line of sight and went still. "Someone lives out here," he said quietly, as if saying it louder might break something. Gideon felt his pulse shift. He hadn't expected people. Not this close. Not in a place that smelled so much like abandonment. Valco barked once more, then sat, upright, composed, staring toward the trees. A moment later, movement. A figure emerged from behind a weathered outbuilding near the property's edge. The building wasn't quite a cabin and wasn't quite a shed. More like a forgotten office from an older era of logging. Its paint flaked and its windows dulled with dust. The woman who stepped into view was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. But she carried herself with a quiet straightness that suggested she'd spent her life refusing to let grief bend her completely. She wasn't tall, average height, slightly rounded at the shoulders from years of work and worry. But there was a steadiness in her stance that made her seem larger than she was. Her hair was silver, pulled back into a simple braid that hung over one shoulder. Her skin was fair, weathered by wind and cold, with fine lines that looked less like age and more like maps of endurance. Her eyes were pale brown, warm when they wanted to be, sharp when they needed to be. She wore a faded denim jacket over a thick sweater and practical boots dusted with dirt, the uniform of someone who still walked her land even when she no longer wanted to. She looked at the group, then at Valco, and something in her expression changed, like a locked door cracking open. "Who are you?" she called, voice firm but not hostile. Gideon stepped forward slowly, palms open. He knew the language of fear and the language of authority. He chose neither. "My name's Gideon Rourke," he said. "Search and rescue. We're not here to cause trouble." Her gaze flicked to Hank's rig, the cables, the tools. "That depends on what you're trying to pull out of my woods," she said. Owen lifted a hand slightly, a calming gesture. "Marla," he said, and the way he spoke her name suggested he knew her, at least by reputation. "We're working the old Hollis tract. We're being careful." At the sound of that name, Marla, Gideon felt the wooden tag in his pack grow heavier. He met her eyes. "Marla Hollis?" he asked. The woman went very still. Valco rose and padded toward her, head low, posture soft. He wasn't in work mode now. He was in something else, something gentler. Marla watched the dog approach, her breath catching slightly. Valco stopped within arm's reach and sat. Gaze lifted to her face, as if recognizing it. Marla's hand hovered in the air for a second, uncertain, then lowered onto Valco's head. Her fingers trembled. "I haven't touched a shepherd in years," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. Gideon's throat tightened. He unzipped his pack and removed the sealed pouch. He didn't offer it like a weapon or a test. He offered it like a question. "We found something in the truck," he said. "A tag, a note, and this." He unrolled the folded strip of cloth carefully, keeping it protected from the damp. The fabric was worn, stained faintly with old paint. Reds and deep greens blurred together like a memory of color. Marla's eyes widened, then softened, then filled. "That's..." Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, stubbornly trying to reassemble herself. "That's Cyrus's." Gideon didn't move. He let her speak. "He used it to wrap his hand when he painted," Marla continued, staring at the cloth as if it might vanish again. "He said it kept the brush from slipping. He said it made him feel steady." Her laugh came out small and broken. "Funny, isn't it? A man steadying himself with a rag." Earl, who looked like he wanted to make a joke and knew better, shifted his weight and stayed quiet. Maya's expression softened in the smallest way, like a number had turned into a person. Hank stared at the ground, jaw tight. Gideon held the cloth out. Marla took it with both hands, cradling it like something fragile and alive. For a moment the woods fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Cyrus brought that truck here," Marla said at last, voice low. "Not me." Gideon nodded, listening. "He was working on it," she went on. "He called it his big kind giant. Said he'd make it the centerpiece of the summer festival. Raise money for the rescue squad, for veterans, for whoever needed a hand. He said the town forgot how to show up for each other. He wanted to remind them." Her eyes lifted to the trees, then past them, as if looking at a version of the world where Cyrus was still alive, and the truck wasn't rusting in the woods. "Then he died," she said, like the word tasted wrong. "Heart sudden, like the universe snapped its fingers. She swallowed, her jaw clenched. A muscle in her cheek jumped. "I didn't drag the truck into the forest," she said, and there was steel in her tone now. "I just couldn't drag it back out." Gideon felt something in his chest twist. A familiar knot of understanding. Marla looked at him sharply, as if she could see the outline of his own pain. "You ever lose something so big," she asked, "that even looking at it feels like drowning?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. His blue-gray eyes stayed steady, but something behind them shifted, like clouds moving across a distant sun. "Yes," he said finally, "more than once." Marla's shoulders sagged a fraction, the first sign of surrender she'd shown. "I hated that truck for a while," she admitted. "Not because it did anything wrong, because it kept him in the room. Every time I saw it, it was like he was standing there, smiling, telling me it would be okay, while he wasn't." Her voice grew thinner. "So I locked the door to that part of my life and told myself I was being strong." She looked down at the cloth in her hands. "But strength isn't always what people think it is." Gideon nodded slowly. He understood too well the lie of constant motion. How working until you collapsed could feel like discipline when it was really avoidance. How silence could masquerade as control. "My way was different," Gideon said, voice quiet. "Same result. I kept moving, kept working, kept my head full so it wouldn't turn on me." Marla's eyes narrowed gently, not judging. "And did it work?" she asked. Gideon's humor flickered, dry and brief. "It worked like duct tape works on a cracked pipe," he said. "Holds until it doesn't." A small, unwilling smile tugged at the corner of Marla's mouth, then disappeared, swallowed by emotion. Valco leaned against her leg, warm and steady. Marla's hand rested on his head without thinking now, as if her body remembered comfort before her mind could argue. Owen cleared his throat softly, giving them a respectful moment, and then pulling the conversation back to earth. "We need permission to work the area," he said, "and we need to do it safely." Marla looked at the truck in the trees, her eyes wet but focused. "I own the land," she said, "or what's left of it on paper." She reached into her denim jacket and pulled out an old key ring, the metal worn smooth from years of use. She held it out to Gideon. "This key opens the office," she said. "There are papers in there, registrations, old receipts, maybe the VIN, maybe Cyrus's notes. I never went back in after he died." Her hand trembled as she extended the keys. "If you're going to bring that giant back," she whispered, "you'll need those." Gideon took the keys carefully, like accepting a vow. Marla's eyes lifted to his. "And Gideon," she said, voice firmer now, as if she were commanding herself as much as him, "if you do this—" She glanced at Valco, then at the truck. "You won't just be pulling metal out of the woods." Her throat worked. She swallowed hard. "You'll be pulling this town out of a long sleep." Gideon felt the weight of her words settle onto his shoulders, not crushing, but claiming. He looked down at Valco. The dog's eyes met his, calm, bright, present, like a lantern in fog. Gideon tightened his grip on the keys. "All right," he said softly. Not quite a promise, but close enough to become one. And in the quiet that followed, the forest seemed to listen, patient as ever, waiting to see if humans could finally earn what they wanted back. The garage on Maple Street didn't look like the birthplace of miracles. It looked like a place where miracles came to get dirty. Maya Larkin's shop squatted behind a faded sign, Larkin Auto and Fab, its letters sun-bleached and stubborn. The building was steel-sided and practical, the kind of structure that existed to survive winters, not impress tourists. Inside, the air held the familiar perfume of work. Old oil, warm rubber, grinding metal, and coffee that had been reheated too many times to still remember hope. Gideon arrived before dawn. That was his way. Show up early so the day didn't have time to surprise him. He parked his truck, slid out in his olive field jacket, and shouldered his Eberly stock half-track like it was part of his spine. The red and deep green plaid beneath his jacket made him look almost like any other man in a northern town, until you saw the way he moved. Controlled. Quiet. Always scanning. Valco jumped down beside him, the black tactical harness snug across his chest and back. The German shepherd's coat, black along the saddle, tan on legs and face, caught the weak morning light like polished armor. His gaze stayed sharp, intelligent, sweeping the lot, the doorway, the corners. 4 legs, 1 mind. Disciplined. They weren't alone for long. Maya stepped out of the side office with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She was the sort of woman who didn't need volume to carry authority. Early 40s, medium height, dark hair braided down her back. Safety glasses rode on top of her head like a crown she'd earned through grit. Her hands weren't grease-blackened. She delegated that to the right moments. But her boots were scuffed, and her posture said she'd spent her life standing her ground in rooms that underestimated her. "You're early," she said. "Habit," Gideon replied. Maya's eyes flicked to Valco. "Good dog." Valco's ears tipped forward, acknowledging the compliment without performing for it. Behind Maya came Earl Bledsoe, carrying a thermos the size of a fire extinguisher and a grin that could weld steel if laughter counted as heat. He was broad, bearded, and permanently dusted with the evidence of labor. Earl's humor was the kind that made heavy things lighter, until it didn't, and then it made room for silence without leaving anyone alone inside it. "Morning, Captain Sirius," Earl called to Gideon, though Gideon had never told him his rank. Earl just had a way of smelling truth like smoke. "Ready to fall in love with Rust?" Gideon's mouth twitched. "Love is a strong word. Rust doesn't care," Earl said. "Rust will take you anyway." Hank Morrow arrived next, driving the tow rig with the patience of a man who'd learned time couldn't be bullied. He was tall and thin, gray-haired, face lined deep with weather and grief. His eyes rarely smiled, but they weren't cruel. They were careful, like he rationed emotion because once, spending too much had cost him everything. Hank stepped down, nodded to Gideon, then to Valco. The dog watched him with calm interest, tail steady. "Got your winch line ready," Hank said. "We did it clean. No hero pulls." Gideon nodded. No hero pulls. They'd moved the truck yesterday, slowly, legally, with Ranger Owen's guidance and Lila's paperwork in place, nudging it out of the worst of the forest's grip and onto a path that allowed Hank's rig to bring it to town without tearing up the land or spilling a drop of old fuel into a stream. It had been work, not spectacle. Now, the real work began. The North Star Project, as Earl started calling it, half joke, half prophecy, sat in the center bay like a sleeping giant dragged into a cathedral. The semi-cab looked brutal under the fluorescent lights, its frame scarred, its body speckled with rust and moss stains, its tires enormous and weary. It smelled like wet iron and old ambition. Marla Hollis came once, quietly. She stood at the garage door as if it were the threshold of a room she'd refused to enter for years. Late 60s, silver braid, denim jacket, eyes pale brown and too full. She didn't step far inside. She didn't touch the truck. She just watched, hands clasped tight, like she was making sure the past didn't bite. "I didn't think it was still that big," she whispered. Earl, surprisingly gentle, offered her coffee. She shook her head. She left after a few minutes, moving like someone walking away from a grave, but trying not to look like it. And Gideon, who understood how grief could turn ordinary objects into monsters, kept working. They started with the basics. Maya mapped the job like a campaign. Compartments, systems, priorities. Fuel lines checked for rot. Electrical harness inspected for corrosion. Frame assessed for stress fractures. Fluids drained safely. A plan written for parts they'd need to wait on, because the real world didn't care about deadlines, and metal didn't regenerate like flesh. Hank focused on stability, keeping the heavy components secure. Earl worked the welds, reinforcing weak points with steady hands. Gideon handled whatever needed hands and patience, scraping rust, cleaning surfaces, labeling parts, bagging bolts, making order out of decay. Valko remained nearby, not underfoot, always aware. He sniffed around the truck, then stopped and stared at one section of the undercarriage. Gideon followed his gaze and found a slow drip, a small leak from a line that should have been dry. Fuel residue, old but real. Valko's nose wrinkled slightly. He stepped back. "Good catch," Maya said when Gideon called it out. Earl raised his eyebrows. "Dog's on payroll now." Gideon's humor surfaced, thin and dry. "He takes payment in jerky." They worked through the morning, and the garage filled with small sounds that were oddly comforting. The scrape of a wire brush, the clink of wrenches, Hank's steady mutter as he checked tension, Maya's pencil tapping against her clipboard like a metronome for sanity. But recovery of vehicles or people was never a straight line. Near midday, while Gideon crawled under the truck to inspect a bracket near the frame rail, Valko moved in close. The dog wasn't anxious, but his nose worked quickly, sniffing the ground, the metal, the air. His ears flicked toward the back corner of the bay, where the shop's old parts bin sat like a graveyard of forgotten steel. Gideon slid out from under the truck and stood. "What is it?" Valko's gaze pinned to the floor near the bin. Gideon followed. A thin strip of rusted wire, left over from the truck's forest prison, had snagged on a piece of metal and curled up like a hook. It barely looked like anything. But Valko stepped forward, paw placed carefully, too carefully, and the wire shifted. A sharp scrape. Valko flinched back. Then a small, bright line of blood appeared on his tan paw. Gideon's stomach dropped. It was ridiculous, objectively. One cut, shallow, not life-threatening. But Gideon's body didn't speak objective language when it came to the things he loved. His pulse surged. His throat tightened. His hands went cold. "Valko!" he snapped, sharper than he meant. The dog's ears lowered slightly, not in fear, but in apology. Valko lifted his paw, looking at Gideon with those dark, intelligent eyes that never begged, only reported. "I'm okay," the look said. "But I'm hurt." Gideon knelt immediately, taking the paw in both hands. The cut wasn't deep, but it bled enough to stain the fur and mark Gideon's fingers red. Maya appeared beside him in a heartbeat, calm as always, eyes scanning. Earl hovered, unusually quiet. Hank's jaw tightened as he watched, like he felt the pain through a memory. Gideon's voice came out rough. "We need a vet." Maya nodded. "Doc Keene, 2 blocks. Gideon didn't wait. He wrapped Valko's paw in a clean shop towel, lifted the dog gently. Not an easy lift, even for a strong man. But Gideon did it with the careful strength of someone carrying something sacred. Valko didn't struggle. He leaned into Gideon's chest, trusting. And that trust, more than the blood, nearly broke Gideon in half. On the short drive to the clinic, Gideon kept one hand on the wheel and one hand on Valko's shoulder, feeling the dog's steady breathing as if it were an anchor line. Valco looked out the window, calm, as if this were just another task. But then, at a stop sign, the dog turned and pressed his muzzle lightly into Gideon's forearm. Not where the bandage was, not where the blood was, where Gideon's old military watch sat, scratched and faithful. Valco held there for a second, eyes half-lidded, breathing slow, like he was reminding Gideon of time, of how it moved forward whether you were ready or not. Gideon's throat burned. He realized, with a sudden and humiliating clarity, that the fear flooding him wasn't about a cut. It was about losing the one living thing that had seen him at his worst and stayed anyway. The truck could rot. The project could fail. But this dog, this partner, was the thin line keeping Gideon from drifting back into the dark parts of himself. And Gideon, who could face storms without blinking, whispered to the windshield like a prayer he didn't believe in until he needed it. Not him. Doc Harper Keene's clinic smelled like antiseptic and wet fur, a strangely comforting combination. Doc Keene was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair cut short, and a face that had the blunt honesty of someone who'd worked both battlefield triage and small-town animals. His eyes were kind, but direct. The kind that didn't let you lie comfortably. He wore a simple flannel under a white coat, sleeves rolled up as if he preferred hands-on truth to polite distance. He took one look at Valco, then at Gideon's white knuckles, and said, "Set him here." Gideon placed Valco on the exam table. Valco stood steady, only a slight tremor betraying pain. Doc examined the paw with practiced calm, cleaning it, checking depth, then stitching two neat little pulls that closed the wound like a whispered promise. "Lucky," Doc said. "Shallow. He'll walk fine." Gideon exhaled so hard it felt like his ribs cracked. Doc wrapped the paw and looked at Gideon over the top of his glasses. "You're shaking," Doc observed. "I'm fine," Gideon lied automatically. Doc's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like patience. "You're not," Doc said. Then, as if delivering a diagnosis Gideon didn't want. "Question is, what are you really trying to fix?" Gideon swallowed, eyes on Valco. The dog met his gaze, steady, unjudging. Doc's voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through armor. "Are you restoring a truck?" Doc asked. "Or restoring yourself?" Gideon's answer stuck behind his teeth, because the truth was too close to the surface now. He hadn't come for the truck, not really. He'd come because something abandoned had called to him, and he didn't know how to ignore that call without hating himself. "I don't know," Gideon said finally, voice low. Doc nodded as if that was the only honest answer worth having. "Good," Doc said. "Not knowing means you're still awake." He handed Gideon the aftercare instructions and added, almost casually, "Keep him calm. No heavy work for a few days." Gideon looked down at Valco. Valco blinked slowly, as if to say, "We'll do what we have to." Back at the garage, Earl had taped a sign to the workbench in thick black marker. "No crying on the spark plugs." Maya saw it and snorted. Hank shook his head once, but the corner of his mouth moved. Barely. Gideon stared at the sign longer than he needed to. Then he laughed. Quietly, once. Like the sound had traveled a long distance to reach him. He knelt beside Valco, careful with the bandaged paw, and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's shoulder. Not a command. Not a mission. A confession without words. When he stood, something inside him had shifted. The truck was no longer just a project. It was a rope thrown across a gap, between past and present, between isolation and community, between a man who survived and a man who could still belong. Gideon tightened the strap of his pack and looked at the giant machine in the bay. He didn't feel like quitting. He felt like coming home. The town fell asleep the way northern towns always did. Quietly, early, with the kind of darkness that didn't feel dangerous so much as final. In Maya's garage, the lights stayed on. Not because anyone was working, because Gideon couldn't bring himself to turn them off. The big truck sat in the center bay like a half-raised monument, its bones exposed, its guts labeled in neat plastic bags and Sharpie handwriting. The air was colder at night, the concrete floor holding the day's chill like a grudge. Outside, wind moved down Maple Street and rattled the roll-up door just enough to make the building sound alive. Gideon sat on an overturned bucket near the workbench, shoulders hunched inside his olive field jacket, boots planted wide as if his body still believed the ground might shift. The plaid of his shirt showed at the collar, bright in the harsh fluorescent light, like a small insult to how tired he felt. His military watch ticked softly, steady, faithful. His pocket knife lay closed on the bench. Not needed tonight. On the wall, Earl's sign, no crying on the spark plugs, hung crooked, the tape peeling at one corner. Gideon stared at it without seeing it. Parts delay, Maya had said. Shipping backlog, specialty fittings, a harness connector that had to be ordered twice because the first one came wrong. Hank had warned him about timelines. Metal didn't care about urgency. Gideon had nodded like he understood. But inside him, something had started to panic. Because waiting was the kind of silence his mind filled with explosions. The truth was, Gideon could handle hard work. He could handle heavy lifting. He could handle pain. Those things made sense. What he couldn't handle, what he had never learned to handle, was meaning. A truck became more than a truck when Marla's hands trembled around Cyrus's rag. A project became more than a project when the town started whispering about North Star like it was a promise. And when Valco bled on the garage floor, Gideon discovered he had something he was afraid to lose. Fear had teeth. It bit harder when it mattered. Valco lay near the door, bandaged paw tucked beneath him. The German shepherd's black and tan coat looked almost bronze under the fluorescent lights. His harness was still on, habit more than necessity. But he rested his head on his front paws with the calm authority of a dog who knew when the fight was in the human, not the room. Gideon hadn't spoken in a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, just packed. He finally reached for his phone, thumb hovering. He didn't want to call anyone. Calling meant admitting this wasn't under control. But the pressure in his chest had turned into a fist, and he needed something, anything, to release it. He hit Hank's number. It rang twice, 3 times. Then Hank answered, voice low and gravelly, like he'd been awake anyway. "Yeah," Hank said. "You all right?" Gideon's throat tightened. He hated questions like that. They invited honesty. "I need you to sell it," Gideon said, words coming out flat. "The truck. I'm done." There was a pause on the line, not long, but heavy. "You're tired?" Hank said. Gideon laughed once, dry and sharp. "That's one word for it." Hank didn't take the bait. He stayed steady. "Tell me why," Hank said. Gideon looked at the truck, at the exposed frame, at the labeled bolts, at the empty space where the engine's heartbeat should be. "It's pointless," Gideon said, and the lie tasted like metal. "It's a pile of rust. It's not worth this." "Not worth what?" Hank asked. Gideon's jaw flexed. "Not worth the waiting," he snapped. "Not worth—" He stopped because the real word was feeling, not worth the way it made him care. Hank exhaled slowly into the phone, and for a moment Gideon heard something behind the sound. An old ache, familiar as winter. "My boy," Hank said quietly. "Used to beg me to take him to those monster truck shows." He'd talk about the engines like they were dragons. Gideon didn't speak. I hated the noise, Hank continued. Still do, because one night on the highway, noise was the last thing I heard before everything split apart. Gideon's grip tightened on the phone. Hank's voice stayed calm, but it had an edge now. Not anger. Conviction. You think selling it will make the feeling go away, Hank said. It won't. It'll just give the feeling a new place to hide. Gideon swallowed. His eyes burned unexpectedly. He hated that. I don't need a lecture, he muttered. Good, Hank said, because I'm not giving one. Another pause. Then Hank's words came like nails driven into wood. I'm not letting thunder take another man, Hank said. Not if I can help it. Gideon's breath stuttered. This is just a truck. Gideon tried again, weaker now. No, Hank replied. It's what you're doing with your hands so your head doesn't eat you alive. Gideon's mouth opened, then closed. Because there it was. Simple, ugly, true. Hank softened his tone. Sleep, Hank said. Do nothing tonight. If you still want to quit in the morning, we'll talk. But don't make a life decision at midnight on cold concrete. The call ended without goodbye. Gideon stared at the dark phone screen for a long moment, as if it might show him the next step. It didn't. The garage felt too bright and too empty. He stood, joints stiff, and pulled on his gloves. He didn't need gloves to walk out the door. He wore them because they made him feel protected from the world. He grabbed his pack and slung it over one shoulder. He was leaving. Not just the garage. Leaving the whole thing. The dream, the promise, the weight of Marla's eyes. The half-built hope of a town that had started to believe again. Outside, the wind howled low. Gideon reached for the door handle and stopped. Valco was standing directly in front of the exit. No bark, no growl, no frantic movement. Just a solid, quiet presence. Shoulders squared, ears up, eyes fixed on Gideon's face. The dog didn't look angry. He looked certain. Gideon froze. Move, he said softly, not as a command, but as a plea disguised as authority. Valco didn't move. Gideon tried to step around him. Valco shifted with him, blocking again, calm, precise, like a bouncer at the door to Gideon's own worst decision. Gideon's chest tightened. Don't do this, Gideon whispered, voice breaking on the last word as if it had sharp edges. Valco lifted his head slightly, eyes steady, unblinking. The dog's bandaged paw made Gideon's stomach twist. Gideon felt the room tilt, not physically, but inside, the way a man's courage tilts when it meets his own truth. He lowered his pack to the floor. Then he sank to his knees right there on the concrete, in front of the door, in front of the dog. His hands went to Valco's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur and the straps of the harness. Gideon's forehead pressed against Valco's shoulder. His voice came out small. I'm tired, he said. I'm so tired. It wasn't about the truck. It was about years of holding everything inside until holding became a cage. Valco didn't whine. He didn't fidget. He simply leaned into Gideon, warm and steady, and then, gentle as breath, licked Gideon's hand. Once, twice. A simple action, a dog's comfort. But it landed like a sentence. Rest if you must. But don't abandon. Gideon's throat tightened, and for a moment he hated himself for how much he needed that. Then slowly, he sat back on his heels and looked at the dog. Valco's eyes were soft now. Still focused, still intelligent, but tender. Gideon breathed in, breathed out. He stood and walked back into the garage. He didn't turn off the lights, not yet. Instead, he grabbed an old sleeping bag from the shelf, something Maya kept for long shifts, and unrolled it near the workbench. He lay down with his jacket still on, boots off, but close. The concrete was cold, but he didn't mind cold. Cold was honest. Valko padded over and lay down at the doorway, body aligned with the gap like a living lock. His head rested on his paws, his ears stayed half alert even as his eyes narrowed. Guarding. Not the truck. The man. Gideon stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights hummed softly. Outside, wind scraped branches against metal. He didn't feel like a winner. He felt like someone who had decided, in the smallest possible way, not to disappear. Before sleep took him, Gideon's hand drifted to his watch. He felt the scratched face under his thumb. Time kept moving. The question was whether he would move with it. In the quiet before dawn, with Valko at the door and the giant truck waiting in pieces, Gideon finally let himself believe one thing. Quitting wasn't rest. Quitting was exile, and he wasn't ready to exile himself again. When he woke, gray morning light slipped through the high garage windows. His muscles ached. His eyes felt gritty. But his chest felt different. Not lighter, clearer. Valko stood and stretched, then looked back at Gideon as if checking the answer to an unspoken question. Gideon nodded once, not triumphant, resolved. Morning arrived in thin, clean sheets of light, pale gold sliding across Maple Street, catching on puddles from last night's drizzle and turning them into scattered coins. Gideon woke on the concrete floor with his jacket still on and his bones complaining like old hinges. The garage smelled the way it always did, oil and metal and work. But today, there was something else in it too. A softness. Like the building had witnessed a man stay when he wanted to vanish, and decided to hold that secret gently. Valko stood at the door where he'd slept, bandaged paw tucked close. He stretched once, long and deliberate, then looked back at Gideon with calm, dark eyes. Watching, not judging. Gideon sat up, rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, and let himself breathe before he let himself think. He didn't do speeches. He didn't do pep talks. He picked up his phone and sent one message to the group chat Maya had created, because even engineers understood the value of a single sentence. Keep going. Then, because words mattered more when you used fewer of them, Gideon made a second call. Maya answered on the second ring, voice already awake. "We're back?" she asked. "We're back," Gideon said. There was a pause, a tiny one, and Gideon could hear her smile in the silence. "Good," she replied. "I'll be there in 20. By the time the others arrived, the day had turned bright and clear, the kind of northern spring day that felt like a reward for surviving winter. Maya came in first, braid down her back, safety glasses perched up like she wore them the way knights wore helmets. Clipboard under her arm, focus in her eyes. She didn't ask Gideon how he slept. She didn't need to. She saw it in his posture, more upright, less hollow. Hank arrived next, stepping into the garage in his brown canvas jacket and gloves. His gray hair was messy, as if sleep had argued with him. His face held the usual guarded distance, but his eyes softened when Valko limped over and nudged his knee with a gentle, familiar insistence. "You holding up, buddy?" Hank muttered to the dog, voice quiet. Valko blinked slowly, tail giving one calm sweep. Earl burst in like a weather front, thermos in one hand, a paper bag of donuts in the other, white beard framing a grin that dared the universe to be sad for too long. "Well, look at that," Earl said, scanning the garage. "Nobody fled in the night. I'm disappointed. I brought donuts for drama." Gideon's mouth twitched. Eat your drama. Deputy Lila Vance showed up not long after, uniform crisp and practical, hair in that low bun that meant business. She carried a folder under her arm, paperwork, VIN records, the sort of administrative armor that kept good people from getting punished for doing the right thing. Behind her came Ranger Owen Calder, boots scuffed, beard like steel wool, eyes pale as cold daylight. He didn't belong in a garage, but he belonged anywhere truth and caution were required. He took a slow walk around the truck, checking for leaks, sniffing the air like he'd learned from wolves. "Any spill?" Owen said, voice low, "and the lake pays. We keep it clean." Maya nodded. "Clean." Gideon glanced toward the open door, and there, at the threshold, stood Marla Hollis. She hadn't been asked to come. She'd chosen to. Her silver braid lay over her shoulder, denim jacket, boots dusted with earth. She looked smaller in the wide garage than she did in the woods, but her eyes were braver today. Still wet around the edges, but braver. In her hand she held a small tin, cookies maybe. Something human, something domestic, as if she needed proof that life could still be ordinary around a machine that carried her husband's shadow. She hovered until Earl noticed her. Earl's voice softened immediately. "Morning, Marla." Marla nodded once, then looked at the truck. She didn't touch it. Not yet. "I just wanted to see," she said, quietly. If today is the day." Gideon felt the weight of that sentence land like a tool in his hands. He nodded once. "We're going to try." They moved into roles as naturally as breathing. Maya took the lead on electrical, fingers quick and sure as she traced connections and checked grounds. Hank handled fuel and pressure, methodical, no wasted motion. Earl reinforced a bracket that had shown hairline weakness, sparks flying like tiny captured stars. Lila stayed at a work table with paperwork, verifying VIN and documenting progress, protecting the project with ink. Owen watched for environmental safety, ready with absorbent pads and a spill kit like a priest guarding the lake's sanctity. Valco sat near Gideon, bandaged paw folded beneath him, posture proud. His harness was on, as always, part habit, part identity. His eyes followed every movement, not nervous, just awake. Gideon moved between tasks like the quiet center of a storm. He checked bolts, tightened, clamps, held a light when someone needed it. He wasn't trying to control the day anymore. He was trying to belong in it. Maya straightened from under the dash and wiped her hands. "Okay," she said. "Electrical is stable. We're as ready as we're going to be." Hank closed the fuel line valve and nodded once. "Pressure's good." Earl leaned back from his weld and lifted his shield. "If it breaks, it won't be my fault." Lila looked up from her folder. "You're clear to start it. I'm documenting this. If anyone asks, we did everything by the book." Earl snorted. "By the book, in a garage. That's adorable." Owen folded his arms and said, "Do it." Marla's hands tightened around her tin. Gideon stepped into the cab. The seat creaked beneath him. The steering wheel felt rough, worn. The interior smelled cleaner than it had, but still carried the ghost of forest damp and old oil. Gideon placed his hands on the wheel and let his breathing slow, not because he was afraid of the machine, because he was afraid of what it meant if it stayed silent. He looked out through the windshield and met Valco's eyes. The dog held his gaze steady as a lighthouse. Gideon turned the key. The starter whined. The engine coughed once, like an old man clearing his throat. Then nothing. Silence dropped. Earl muttered something unholy. Hank's jaw tightened. Marla's face drained slightly, and she looked away like she'd been slapped by hope. Gideon sat still. Old Gideon would have cursed, slammed the dash, demanded the universe cooperate. but last night had burned something out of him, or maybe forged something new. He exhaled slowly, in, out, calm. He opened the door and climbed down. Maya was already moving, tracing a connection with a test light. "Hold," she said, eyes narrowed. "Give me 1 minute." Hank leaned in, adjusting a setting, listening like he could hear lies in metal. Earl tapped the side of the cab gently with his knuckles. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured to the truck. "Don't embarrass me in front of the ranger." Marla watched from the doorway, fingers white on the tin. Valco shifted once, then sat again, posture tall. Not anxious, not pleading. Witnessing. Maya straightened. "Try again." Gideon climbed back into the cab and took the key. He didn't look at the others this time. He looked at the lake wind moving the trees outside the open bay door. Then he turned the key again. The starter spun. The engine coughed, harder this time. A beat. Then, like thunder waking up in a mountain, the engine roared to life. The sound filled the garage, not angry, not violent, but immense. A deep, rolling growl that vibrated through concrete and bones and memories. It wasn't a noise so much as a declaration. I'm still here. For half a second, nobody moved. Then Marla made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She covered her mouth with one hand as tears spilled over. Earl threw his welding glove into the air and shouted, "She talks!" Maya's face softened into a rare, unguarded smile. The look of a woman who'd solved a hard equation and found a heartbeat inside it. Hank turned away fast, as if the garage had suddenly gotten dusty. He lifted a hand and wiped his eyes once, rough and quick, then pretended he'd done nothing. Lila's lips parted into a small grin. "Documented," she said softly, and her voice sounded lighter than it had in weeks. Owen nodded once, solemn as a judge. "Clean start," he said. Valco stood. He didn't bark, he didn't jump. He simply lifted his head, ears forward, eyes bright, like he'd been waiting for the world to remember its own music. Gideon climbed down, engine still rumbling. The sound wasn't just in the air, it was inside his chest. Marla stepped 1 foot into the garage, just one, and held the tin out toward Gideon like an offering. "Cyrus would have," she began, then couldn't finish. Gideon took the tin gently. "He's here," Gideon said quietly, and surprised himself with how true it felt. In the work, in the people, in the reason. Marla nodded, tears on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Earl, incapable of letting the moment stay too heavy, gestured grandly toward the truck. "Well," he boomed, "what's her name?" Maya raised an eyebrow. "It needs a name?" "It absolutely needs a name," Earl insisted. "If we're going to argue with it for the next decade, we should at least be on a first-name basis." Gideon looked at the truck, then at Valco, then past the open bay door to the bright northern sky and the invisible line where the lake met the horizon. In training, Gideon had learned to navigate by stars when everything else failed. He'd learned there was one point in the night that stayed steady, a fixed guide when your world spun. He swallowed. "North Star," he said. Earl blinked. "That's actually good," Gideon nodded once. "North Star Titan." Maya smiled, approving. Hank's shoulders eased. Lila wrote it down like it mattered, because it did. Gideon stepped closer to Valco and knelt, rubbing behind the dog's ear. "And you," Gideon murmured. "You get your signature." Maya, already thinking ahead, pulled out a small stencil sheet she'd been working on. Simple, clean. A paw print. Not huge, not flashy, just enough to say, "This was found by a dog who refused to let a man disappear." They didn't paint it yet. Not today. Today was for sound and proof of life. But Gideon held the stencil in his hands and felt something settle. Not victory, belonging. 2 weeks later, the town gathered by the lake for the spring festival. Smaller than the summer event Cyrus had dreamed of, but real, warm, and crowded with neighbors who wanted to believe again. A woman named Cass Wainwright stood near the stage with a leash in her hand and calm in her posture. Cass was in her early 30s, athletic, with sun-browned skin and short auburn hair tucked under a cap. She carried herself like someone who knew dogs better than people, and liked it that way. A professional K-9 trainer, she'd helped socialize Valco around crowds and noise, teaching him the discipline of stillness in chaos. Valco sat at Gideon's side, harness on, bandage long gone, posture perfect. The dog's eyes tracked children running, balloons bobbing, the shimmer of water behind the tents. North Star Titan rumbled in on cue, gleaming more now, proud in the sunlight. The crowd cheered. Then the horn sounded, just once, to announce arrival. A small boy near the front startled hard, face scrunching, hands flying to his ears. His breath became quick and shallow, panic rising like a wave. Gideon immediately knelt beside him, voice low and steady. "Hey," he said softly. "Look at me." We breathed together. The boy's eyes were wide, wet. Valco moved in close and sat. Downstay, solid as a rock, no pushing, no licking, just a warm presence. The boy's hand drifted to Valco's harness and gripped it like a handle on a lifeboat. Cass watched from a distance, nodding slightly. Approval without intrusion. The boy's breathing slowed. The panic loosened. And in that tiny moment, under blue sky and beside bright water, Gideon saw it. The truck had been a giant. But Valco was the star. Marla stood with Lila near the edge of the crowd, fingers pressed to her lips, eyes shining. She leaned toward Gideon when the moment passed and whispered, voice barely audible over the festival. "Cyrus used to say, 'Dogs know the way home.'" Gideon looked at Valco, then at the people smiling in the spring sun, then at the truck that had once been swallowed by woods and silence. Home, he realized, wasn't a place without pain. Home was a place where pain didn't have to live alone. He rested his hand on Valco's shoulder and let the warmth stay there. "Yeah," Gideon murmured, "have to, Marla, have to the wind." He was right. Sometimes God doesn't send a miracle with thunder and angels. Sometimes he sends it as a quiet nudge on an ordinary morning. A change in the wind, and a faithful dog who refuses to let a broken man walk away. Gideon thought he was restoring a machine. But what truly came back to life was something deeper. Courage, purpose, and the ability to belong again. And that's how grace often works in everyday life. God doesn't always remove the pain. He places the right companion beside us. He lights one small step ahead. And he reminds us that what's been left behind can still be redeemed. If you're watching this and you're carrying something heavy, hear this. You don't have to fix your whole life today. You just have to take the next right step. Show up, breathe, ask for help, hold on to what is good, and trust that God can turn even rusted, forgotten seasons into something that moves again. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what you're fighting through, or what faithful Valco has helped you keep going. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories and stay with us for the next journey. May God bless you, protect you, and strengthen you. May He give you peace in your mind, warmth in your home, and steady ground under your feet. And may He guide you like a north star, even on the nights when the road feels dark. Amen.